Now we turn to the current international events. Of course, the situation around the Ukrainian crisis. I have told you in detail now and before that the 27th of January marked the 80 years since the liberation of Auschwitz by the Red Army. I'm already a Vice-Birkenau. I just want to remind you in the context of already modern events. And who was guarding this camp then? Although the word protection is still more of some kind of positive meaning. Who were these very supervisors? Let's recall. They were punishers from the UPA, from the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. And why are we remembering this today? Because they are not anathematized, they are not cursed forever. No, on the contrary, they are heroized and staged, elevated to the rank of heroes by the Kyiv regime. Here is the most recent example. These days, the Ukrainian Institute of National Memory celebrates 130 years since the birth of the artist Boris Kryukov, who collaborated with the Nazis. But it's a historical fact that he was a collaborator. And at the same time, the Kyiv regime is trying to erase the memory of the liberator wars, in the ranks of which, along with Russians and representatives of other peoples of the Soviet Union, there were Ukrainians, although I repeat again, but they did not share then. Well, maybe the songs were sung in the language, maybe some national dishes were prepared from what was there, maybe some of them told stories from the life of their regions, their cities. But they did not divide each other by nationality. All over the country. I would rather say for all that remains of Ukraine because of the actions of the Kyiv regime, Western sponsors, nationalists with maniacal frenzy demolish monuments and destroy mass graves of Red Army soldiers. But, as a matter of fact, let me quote the deputy of the Verkhovna Rada Bazansky. In Ukraine, under the pretext of decommunization, as he said, they did everything. This is a direct quote, to erase the names of genuine heroes from the mass consciousness, forget about the labor and military exploits of millions of people, deprive the country of its deserved place among the winners in World War II. And it was all the more disgusting to see at the events of Baby Mir and the Polish Auschwitz about the sacred geographical names, but in fact, really sacred places for people. Here. Well, it was really disgusting to see how Zelensky was there in those days, on which the Holocaust Memorial Day is celebrated, according to the resolution of the UN General Assembly. And why? Well, how can this be? How can a person say, yes, but still the leader, let's say, of the Kyiv regime, who personally signs documents and orders the demolition of monuments and glorification, that is, the glorification of collaborators and Nazi henchmen,
глорификации, то есть героизации коллаборационистов и нацистских приспешников.
And he, knowing that there are representatives of nationalist battalions in the ranks of the armed forces of Ukraine, whose symbolism is the same as that of the SS. And he also stands and ostentatiously empathizes with the victims of the Holocaust. Well, he did not tell about how he shows tireless concern for the glorification, perpetuation of Bandera and Shukevich, other fascist collaborators. Why didn't he tell about how he elevated to the rank of literally saints those who have the blood of hundreds of thousands of innocent women, the elderly, and children on their hands? By the way, different nationalities too. There are Jews, Poles, Ukrainians, Russians, Belarusians, all under one comb. That's what cynicism is. You already know. They say the highest samples. And here it's probably better to say the lowest samples, but so certified. Zelensky's appearance at Auschwitz caused outrage in Jewish religious circles in Poland. The chief rabbi of the country, I mean the Polish state, Mikhail Shudryk, said that their representatives considered it a shame to be at the same event with a dictator who has tamed Nazis. I thank Michael Shudryk for this civic courage. It really is. You can't say it better. This is a regime that stands at the head of the remnants of a state that it itself has destroyed, which has really tamed Nazis, with the appropriate symbols, under the appropriate banners, with the appropriate ideology and the appropriate heroes. Moreover, all this became the basis for the transformation of this regime from extremist and neo-Nazi to terrorist. They do not lag behind their ideological idols, and modern Bandera continue to terrorize the civilian population, to carry out attacks on civilian infrastructure. From the 21st to the 23rd of January, in the village of Novostroevka I, Belgorod region, on the section of the Yasny-Zory-Cheremoshnya highway, on the Besanovka-Orlovka highway on the Oktyabrski-Melanovka road, the APU used shock drones. 5 people were injured. On January 29th, a 2-year-old child, his mother, 1 child and his father were injured as a result of a drone attack. In the village of Razumnoy, on January 21st, the Chronozists attacked the village of Kornoy in the Klimovsky district of the Bryansk region. A private residential building was destroyed. The fire truck, which arrived at the scene in order to extinguish the fire, was also damaged. Forward from the 21st to the 26th of January, the AFU did not stop shelling Gorlovka, including with cluster munitions. As a result, 4 people were killed, 23 people, including a child, were injured. Every time we talk not only about crimes, but also about the punishment for these crimes. And I will do it now. Russian courts continue to sentence Ukrainian neo-Nazis and mercenaries for war crimes. A mercenary from Georgia, Azovets Nikolay Buryanidze, was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of 3 Russian servicemen in Mariupol in March of the 22nd. Mercenaries from Georgia Elnur Abov, Jela Kabarashvili, Ramazia Zhandzadze, Timur Aliyev, as well as Alexander Sverchkov from Latvia, received 14 years of imprisonment in absentia. Georgy Gigari also received mercenaries from Georgia for 6 and 7 years. All of them are on the international wanted list. The so-called soldiers of fortune from Colombia, Pablo Puentes Borges, who was captured in the Kursk region, was taken into custody. The law enforcement agencies of our country continue to work to bring to justice Ukrainists, foreign mercenaries, for military and other crimes. Now, I would like to say a few words about who is behind the Kyiv regime. Europe is closely following the first steps of President Trump, as you can also see, trying to understand what Washington's approach to the situation around Ukraine will be, whether American military assistance will remain, on what scale, to what extent they will assist the Kyiv regime. So far, there are not too many reasons for optimism among Europeans. Speaking to reporters, President Trump said that he would study the possibility of further supplies of weapons and military equipment to the armed forces of Ukraine. Against this background, information appeared about the dismissal of all personnel who were responsible in the White House and the Pentagon for organizing military assistance to the Kyiv regime. Foreign military analysts claim that on the 22nd of January, the United States withdrew all applications by the contractor for logistics through Constance and Varna. All shipments to Ukraine have been suspended at NATO bases in Europe. The new head of the FBI, Cash Hotel, expressed his intention to investigate the misuse of funds for the needs of the Kyiv regime. In general, all these years, we have not been talking about inappropriate spending, but we have been talking about a monstrous corruption scheme that was built on blood by representatives of the White House under Biden with the Kyiv regime. The Kiev regime, as a matter of fact, is something that was created by the hands of the Anglo-Saxons, as we understand, including in order for this corrupt machine to start working on such a scale. And the scale, as you saw, there were not tens of billions, and we read, but hundreds of billions. Back in December of the 24th year, the FBI said that initiating such a procedure to find out what tens of billions of dollars that the United States allocated to Ukraine as financial assistance were spent on. I would like to remind you that we have given examples of how this aid did not reach Ukraine at all, simply dissolving. It left the White House in the form of a decision. It came out in the form of cash tranches, but it did not reach Ukraine, the APU, or lethal aid, logistical assistance, reaching Ukraine, immediately surfaced in other parts of the world. This all requires investigation. Then, in December of the 24th year, the hotel admitted that Zelensky's words could not be trusted because he had lied too much, and for a long time. According to the Accounts Chamber of the United States under the Biden administration, Congress has allocated more than $170 billion to assist the Kiev regime. On January 25th, as Secretary of State Mark Rubio ordered the immediate suspension of funding for almost all foreign aid programs for 90 days. It was noted that decisions on the continuation of changes or termination of funding programs will be made based on the results of an audit to be conducted by the State Department. The U.S. Agency for International Development has already suspended projects related to assistance to Ukraine. Let me remind you, this is the same Agency for International Development that supplied the fire extinguishing system of Ukraine at a time when California was in dire need of them. In the 24th year, let me remind you, this assistance consisted of $4 billion. The Verkhovna Rada openly acknowledged the significant scale of the problems that Ukraine was not ready for. Oksana Romanyuk, head of the Ukrainian Institute of Mass Media, stressed that almost 90% of the country's mass media survived on grants. What does this mean? But there are grants that come from the United States of America, respectively. Those who receive them must work them out. This is not humanitarian aid. This is not a charitable activity when the one who gives remains anonymous and tries not to de-anonymize himself in any way, but does this exceptional empathy, and so on. This is an order. Grants are given for the implementation of a certain agenda. It's obvious. This is not gratuitous assistance. It is not just unaccountable funds that are given at the request and so on. These are American grants to the Ukrainian mass media, which had to do the appropriate work with the appropriate goal setting. Imagine, I emphasize once again, 90% of the Ukrainian mass media existed at the expense of American grants, but not from charitable organizations, NGOs, or representatives of civil society, but the U.S. Agency for International Development. What is it known for? I think you all know it well. These signals were received with nervousness in NATO and the EU. Their officials literally began to compete with each other in aggressive Russophobic rhetoric, scaring both themselves and Europeans with the mythical Russian threat again. In other words, changes have taken place in Washington, but Russia is again seen as a threat. Well, there is, of course, a fantastic story, of course. And the NATO Secretary General, for example, Ryud, again warned according to the old methodological principles that the loss, as he said, of Ukraine would cost the North Atlantic Alliance not billions, but trillions of dollars. I want to understand what kind of mathematics it is. What do these formulas consist of? According to the European Commissioner for Defense Andrius Kubilius, a direct quote, every day, while Ukraine continues to fight, makes the European Union and NATO stronger. It's not about mathematics anymore. It's probably already about physics. I want to understand what kind of school perverts are, where there is such mathematics and such physics. High representatives of the European Union for Foreign Affairs, Security Policy Callas, we recall. She recalled the aid already allocated to the Kyiv regime by Brussels. And this, by the way, is about 50 billion euros for weapons. So she called on the countries to further increase defense spending by reducing spending on education and medicine. Own education, medicine. Well, that's absurd. Now, if it were those who are, they call themselves, the light of democracy, they would put on popular referendums. I imagine what answers they would get. In Switzerland, any question, including I do not know how to move a fence from one street to another, in what color to paint some walls of socially significant buildings, remains for a referendum. They have such a culture. They have this approach. Can you imagine what issues of the life of the European continent we are talking about? Against the background of migration problems that they have created for themselves by manipulations in the regions of North Africa and the Middle East, against the background of the absence of a unifying agenda in conditions of monstrous de-ideologization. I use ideologization in a good sense of the word, but de-ideologization of society, because society is divided. No one understands, nothing unites them, not culture. Culture, on the contrary. The reason for clashes in the West now is not religion, not some kind of common goals and objectives. On the basis of absolute ideological chaos, when no one can explain the philosophy of the future. They are further reducing spending on the humanitarian sphere and further trying to further inflame the conflict around Ukraine. And what is the conflict of Ukraine? The center of Europe, understanding, and they cannot fail to understand, that we are already talking about a terrorist regime, and they are perfectly aware, I mean a certain part of their experts, are well aware of what happens when a terrorist regime receives uncontrolled weapons, money, and an absolute mandate for permissiveness for many years. They know examples of how it is simply impossible to put this terrible genie back into the bottle later. And despite this, they still continue to seek funds at the expense of their own citizens to strengthen, so to speak, the terrorist Kyiv regime. Now about this topic, which is constantly being exaggerated. Zelensky's historical manipulations regarding the negotiation process are already underway. Why do I say that? Because he's lying outright. It's just pure lies. He tried to justify the decision he made in the spring of the 22nd year to withdraw from the negotiation process and fight to the last Ukrainian with a simple outright lie. Remember, on January 25th, at a press conference with the president of Moldova, he said that the purpose of the ban on direct negotiations with Russia was the need to stop the threat of separatism in Ukraine. Zelensky said that I stopped separatism in our state very quickly. It's just that, Zelensky said again, he forbade anyone, any political figures in the country, to hold certain negotiations with the Russian side, Putin's supporters, during the war, end quote. In his inflamed mind, Moscow allegedly tried to put pressure on the deputies of the Verkhovna Rada, you and us officials to use many, direct quote, shadow negotiation corridors that threatened the independence of Ukraine. I'm not going to quote all this nonsense from Zelensky. I would like to quote Russian President Vladimir Putin. He commented on the 28th of January to remind that all the answers have already been given. The only thing I want to say is that it feels like I'm already feeling the absolute collapse of my own. This is not even a policy of his own terrorist activities. Zelensky will now lie like this about literally everything. In other words, it will no longer be manipulation, but it will be an outright direct lie. Moreover, all this is happening against the background of statements by the curators of the Kyiv regime themselves from Britain, from the United States of America under the Biden administration, from the NATO members, that these statements are being made with recognition of how in the 22nd year they put pressure on the Kyiv regime in order to stop these negotiations. And now he says that it was such a cunning maneuver, a political development to stop the trend towards separatism. Everyone said, including Boris Johnson, that it was a Western decision to withdraw the Kyiv regime from the negotiation process, because they had other plans, and these plans were announced both directly and in general. They were all directly announced. Some were voiced in official interviews, the second leaked to the media, that their task was to prolong the conflict and kill, as George W. Bush said, as many Russians as possible, so that later it would not have to be done by the future generation. This idea was developed by many Western so-called figures. That's why the negotiations were stopped, because they didn't need a peaceful settlement. And Barrel and many others talked about it. Remember, and quotes about the battlefield, and quotes about the force that must prevail, and so on, and so on. And, by the way, these quotes and these statements continue. They continued until the recent past, that the time has not yet come. The time has not come, as Blinken said, for the negotiation process, and so on and so on. And now suddenly Zelensky began to rant that it was such an important strategy to preserve the integrity of Ukraine. Of course, his next fantasies are also connected with the fact that questions about his legitimacy, or rather illegitimacy, are rising in full growth in Ukraine itself. And, by the way, this is the true meaning of the termination of the negotiation process in the 22nd year by him. Zelensky is explained in his other quotes. In particular, he called on the international community to put pressure on Moscow and bring peace closer by force. In other words, it turns out that in the 22nd year, it was not a strategy to preserve Ukraine, but again a bet on a forceful solution to the issue. Well, everything is clear, and why he contradicts himself, and what is happening there. And now his mobilization in Ukraine, the current state of affairs of the armed forces of Ukraine, according to the words and statements of the representatives of Ukraine themselves, remains deplorable. They continue to bear heavy losses. It turns out that the quality of reserves prepared by Western instructors in a number of NATO countries is far from the expectations of Kyiv's so-called strategists. Following the 155th Brigade, trained in France in the event of mass desertion amid supply problems. Problems with the provision are also observed in the 153rd Brigade, prepared by Germany. In the Italian media, Zelensky said that a direct 100 men from 25 years old, I mean Ukrainian men, is not enough for mobilization. He will also tell us later that he personally was against lowering the mobilization age in Ukraine. But was he misunderstood or translated the wrong way? No, we are going to record everything, every word, every quote, because this is an accusation. This is self-accusation, which simply requires historical fixation. Here's the deputy, the head of his office, Colonel Pavel Polisa, told one of the American agencies on January 24th that they see, direct quote, a huge mobilization reserve in young men in Ukraine from 18 to 25 years old. This is the betrayal of one's own people. They are neo-Nazis, not only in relation to the Russian-speaking population,
к русскоязычному населению.
They are neo-Nazis in relation to the population of Ukraine, citizens of Ukraine.
Гражданам Украины.
They do not divide them into Russian-speaking, not Russian-speaking. This was the first stage. Now the Kyiv regime is already destroying its citizens. This can only be said by someone who sincerely hates his people, his compatriots.
Свой народ, своих соотечественников.
There is no other explanation for this. And the same deputy head of Zelensky's office said that the necessary legal innovations for their, as he said, just think about it, voluntary conscription. Have you seen how people are being conscripted voluntarily in Ukraine? What's going on? That people are being torn apart. At least an arm, at least a leg. But this Ludolev should bring it to the military enlistment office. So, the necessary legal innovations for voluntary conscription in Ukraine are at the final stage.
Находится на завершающей стадии.
At the same time, Bankova consciously takes such a step in order to fulfill strict requirements. Whose and what the people of Ukraine demand, does civil society demand? I don't know. Veterans demand? No. This is a requirement that the Anglo-Saxons have set before the Kyiv regime, and the replenishment of the ranks of the armed forces of Ukraine at the expense of young guys who have just come of age, so no one in Washington and London hid it. They talk about it in plain text. Meanwhile, according to a survey by the Ukrainian Foundation for Democratic Initiative, every third resident of Ukraine at the age of 18-29 would like to go abroad and stay there for permanent residence if the borders are opened for all categories of the population. Well, how is the young democracy in Ukraine? Doesn't want to talk to his own people. In the Telegram channels, information appeared that in the Kharkiv and Sumy regions, local military enlistment offices of the command of the 92nd Separate Assault Brigade began recruiting minors. Think about it. Minors from among orphans. We have repeatedly talked about this. They didn't believe us before. They said, well, this can't be. Now they no longer say that there is no such thing. The citizens of Ukraine understand that it is. They can't do anything because it's too late. They recruit orphans. They take children from dysfunctional families. The units formed from them are intended to participate in combat operations in the Suchansk border area. Meanwhile, warnings of the Ukrainian General Staff have leaked into the information field that without general mobilization in Ukraine, reserves will run out by the summer. It's obvious what's going on, but to call it by its proper names in Ukraine is to be afraid. And I will call the genocide of its own population taking place in Ukraine by those whom the population of Ukraine has chosen as their leaders. A unique historical situation. Well, it's true that those who hide behind national, not just national interests, but national and ethnic interests, to preserve, as they say, the Ukrainian ethnos, to support Ukrainian culture and history. They also destroy the bearers of this culture and this history. It is the West that has deceived humanity many times. He deceived different peoples, deceived different countries. What just wasn't there? Yes, as a matter of fact, this morning I watched another representative of the American legislature during the day and told that the occupation and aggression of the United States against Iraq were built on a monstrous lie. These statements were made officially. They deceived many people, but since they deceived Ukraine and the Ukrainian people, it seems to me that this is unprecedented. That's to such a degree of cynicism and to such a degree of bitterness and frenzy in the desire to exterminate this people and this state and this country. This country. By the way, they are already talking about the proposal to use weapons to force entry into the ranks of the VSO. But in fact, we understand that it is already being applied. Because when people are taken out of their homes, from cars, from public transport, or just on the streets of Ukrainian cities, people are attacked. This is done only by the right of strength and the strong, simply because people understand that force will be applied to them, and not just physical strength. Kulaks, there are several people there that are patrolmen who accompany all this, they are armed. In other words, it will simply be introduced as some kind of, apparently, absolute norm, that is, if they are now hiding behind some kind of emergency or an urgent need, then later people will simply come and take them under escort, directly, openly. The Kyiv regime, in other words, is ready for the most severe repressions. We ask our own people just to drive them into the trenches for their own purposes. These goals are self-serving. This includes preserving the power of those who legitimately no longer have it, and, of course, covering up all the crimes that have been committed. And these crimes were committed, among other things, within the framework of a colossal, as we have repeatedly said, inter-Atlantic, transatlantic corruption scheme in which countries, states, regimes, communities, groups, and so on are involved. And, of course, a few words about what is happening around the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church. In Ukraine, they do not stop mocking the walk. As the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church reported on its website on January 23rd, just think about how they called it. The solemn transfer of the relics of Saints Andrew I called, and Prince Vladimir, to the head of the Uniates, by Alexander Drabinka, to the metropolitans of the schismatic Orthodox allegedly Church of Ukraine, Sviatoslav Shevchuk, under the slogans of unity within the Ukrainian people, and the Kiev Church, took place. I would like to remind you that Saint Andrew I called is especially revered in world Orthodoxy, according to a number of legends. He is considered the first enlightener of the Russian land. The wholly equal to the apostles Prince Vladimir is the Baptist of Russia, transferred to the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. The particles of their relics belong to the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church. In the 18th year, the Kiev Transfiguration Cathedral, where they were stored, was seized by self-consecrators from the so-called Orthodox Church of Ukraine. This was facilitated by the rector of the temple, the aforementioned Rastriga Alexander Drabinka. He imagined that these shrines, Orthodox shrines, are almost his property, and he can dispose of them alone. But do you know what it's called? You can say a stripper, you can say a schismatic there, but in fact it's just a fraud who is a real apostate and a traitor to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and all orthodoxy. The Orthodox Church, the so-called Ukraine, cynically speculates on illegally appropriated shrines. She has nothing to do with them at all. Schismatics and Uniates have repeatedly publicly spoken about the importance of creating, as they formulate it, a single Christian church in Ukraine. This is said, as it were, by those who call themselves Orthodox. However, this action with the transfer of the relics of the great saints, they only confirmed that the achievement of their declared goal, in fact, implies banal raiding, theft of the property of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. But they were trying to eliminate it in any way. And now they are talking about unity and complacency. They do not disdain any illegal, dirty, immoral methods. Surprisingly, all this coincided with the speech of Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople at the session. Do you think at the council at some, or at some meeting of the representative? No, he spoke in the Pas on January 27th, and noted that Thomas, presented by him in 2019, remember, is a church decree that fixes the decision of the Holy Synod of the Patriarchate of Constantinople on granting independence to one or another church. So this supposedly presented Thomas of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, as he was told, a direct quote, healed the wounds and disagreements of centuries. All the time I want to ask, did you look out of the window at all? Did you open the phone? Was the computer turned on? Healed wounds and disagreements. There is a massacre going on between people who should pray together. They kill each other. Priests are kidnapped, beaten, killed. Churches are set on fire. And here, he is talking about some kind of healing of the wound of disagreements. Behind the lawlessness in Ukraine, Westerners have always stood naturally, who used all the methods of the dirtiest in order to destroy, not even divide people, but destroy orthodoxy in Ukraine as such. Pervert beyond recognition, substitute the concept. That's what they do. But I would like to say that on January 29th, an updated version was published on the website of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, updated in comparison with the state of the Russian Foreign Ministry's report on the situation with the illegal actions of the Kyiv regime in the context of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, clergy, parishioners, and so on. The first report was prepared by us a little less than a year ago. Now it is updated, supplemented. The document includes 8 sections, and I would like to announce that on February 4th, the Special Representative of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation for Cooperation in the Field of Ensuring the Rights to Freedom of Religion, Ambassador at Large of the Russian Foreign Ministry, Mr. Skaldovich, will present this report at the press center of the Russian Foreign Ministry. We invite representatives of the mass media, representatives of international human rights structures, confessions, and simply those who are not indifferent to the fate of millions of Orthodox believers in Ukraine to read this report. If you have any questions in advance for this presentation, send direct. We will prepare detailed answers. The fact is that over the past, I probably wasn't accurate. I said, a little over a year ago, a report was published. The report was published a year and a half ago. It was published in the 23rd year in July, so over the past year and a half since the publication of this first report, the situation in the religious sphere of Ukraine has not improved in the direction of healing wounds, as Varflom said in Pace, but on the contrary, it has degraded, it has rapidly deteriorated. This is also the persecution of canonical orthodoxy, which is only intensifying. This is both mockery and harassment of believers. I will not anticipate the presentation of this report now. I invite you to join it and send questions online. And the most important thing is just to get acquainted with the report. I emphasize once again, it is available on the website of the Russian Foreign Ministry. All of these facts once again confirm the current special military operations to denazify, demilitarize Ukraine, and eliminate threats emanating from its territories. As the Russian leadership has repeatedly stated, all of them will be fulfilled. But this is not all that is connected with Ukraine. We are now moving on to an extremely complex topic. It is difficult even to voice it. It is very difficult to perceive it. I have no idea what people are facing. I'm talking now about the Russian River District, the Kursk region, which have experienced all this, and many have not. The Kiev tourist regime, as you know, has staged more than one brutal massacre of civilians. As of those regions that they consider their own, they also consider those who are being bullied as their citizens, despite the fact that these citizens have not considered themselves as such for a long time. But they carry out brutal massacres of civilians as well our country, which do not relate to them at all. The militants of the Ukrainian armed formations committed another outrage, and these outrages were recorded by the recently liberated by the armed forces of the Russian Federation. In the village of Ruskoye Poreknoye, Zelensky district of the Kursk region, we have repeatedly commented on this topic, and there were operational comments during briefings. We will definitely place links to these materials in the text of the briefing, but we consider it necessary, extremely important, I would say, saving for the whole world to talk about this crime constantly. This is not only necessary for residents of the Kursk region. This is necessary for the whole world because the world needs to understand who the Westerners are sponsoring and what the Kyiv regime is doing with Western money, with these hundreds of billions of dollars and euros. These inhuman crimes are evidence of the terrorist and neo-Nazi insides of the Kyiv regime, which, in its vicious military and political impotence against the backdrop of defeat at the front, committed a literally cannibalistic action against civilians. On January 18th, Russian and military personnel found the bodies of local residents tortured and killed by the coronation Nazis in the basements of rural residential buildings in Russky Porekno. At first, people were tortured, bullied, and then either finished off with gunshots or blown up with grenades. 21st century. Everything was adopted. The Declaration on Human Rights, a huge number of statements, how many summits were held. After all, Westerners literally wrote into every document a provision on human rights, tolerance, humanity, and humanism. And now everything has been washed away in 1 second. All these words, statements are not seen and not heard. And we'll show you. And today, following the results of the briefing, we will distribute the relevant photographic materials that we received from Russian law enforcement officers. And you will look for yourself. And you will see for yourself. It's impossible to watch it. I warn you right away. But we need to know, because on the frames of the documentary video and photography, it was made by our Russian military on the scene, there is evidence of a monstrous bloody crime and outrage against all human beings, a complete violation of morality. The torn bodies of mostly elderly citizens of Russia were found. The old people were bullied. And on the other hand, what do we want? Do you remember how it started? From the Alley of Angels, children were killed. And how can one not understand that this is not an exception to Western politics, including with regard to our country, but also, first of all, to deep philosophy? And let's remember the terrorist attacks in the North Caucasus in the 90s and early 2000s. Against whom, first of all, they were directed and committed by nobody, by those who were greeted in the State Department, at the Downing Street Foreign Office as fighters for democracy of the best friends. Against whom did these inhumans commit a terrorist attack then? And I remind you, Budanovsk, what was that? There was a hospital in which there were women in labor, newborns and pregnant women. Beslan, school during the holiday, children were forced to drink urine just to survive. That's who is the hero of this ultra-liberal agenda, as if democracy in the Western manner. And it's the same here. Elderly people, the elderly have become the objects of not just violence but torture. Hands bound with duct tape, signs of torture, bruises from blows, wounds from gunshot wounds. Along with people, with the corpses of people, the corpses of animals were found. I do not know how to comment on this, really. It seems like you think that you have already seen everything. All the questions have ever been answered are diverse, but I do not know how to say and how to comment on it. That's what it takes to be just inhumans, to torture old people, civilians, beat, wound, and then blow up with grenades.
мирных жителей бить, ранить, а потом взрывать гранатами.
The main military investigation department of the Investigative Committee of Russia has opened a criminal case against members of Ukrainian armed formations involved in a terrorist act against civilians in the Kursk region, under paragraph B of Part 3 of Article 205 of the Criminal Code of the Russian Federation, a terrorist act that caused the death of a person. A low bow to those law enforcement officers who are engaged in this. I can't imagine what kind of courage it takes to find self-control and not give in to emotions, because only one photo. Even I saw the reaction of adult men, grabbing in order to lose this necessary calmness for work. It's impossible to watch. But this is not work with photographs, this is work with the remains of people. During the preliminary investigation, the involvement of a number of Ukrainian servicemen from the 92nd Separate Assault Brigade in this crime was established. Among them is a serviceman Yevgeny Borisenko, the commander of the 11th Company of the 4th Battalion with the call sign Kumar, 3 servicemen with the call signs Motul, a conductor and an artist. That's true, isn't it? Like in horror movies. Even the call signs are the same. You know, an artist for the elderly, apparently. They are suspected of committing a terrorist act, rape, violent acts of a sexual nature, committed by a group of persons by prior agreement. These citizens illegally crossed the state border of the Russian Federation in September of the 24th year, invaded the territory of the Kursk region, and during the fighting in the Sujinski district of the Kursk region. This Yevgeny Pavlichenko was detained by servicemen of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. During the interrogation as a suspect, he fully admitted his guilt. He gave detailed testimony about the commission of serious crimes by him and his accomplices. From September 28th to November 24th of the 24th year, Fabrisenko, Motul, conductor, artist, following the orders of their commander with the call sign Calm, killed 11 men in the village of Russian Porekno, did not kill 3 women. In addition, they committed rape and sexual violence against 8 women, who were then killed. Then, the accomplices moved the bodies of the 22 citizens they killed to the basements of private residential buildings in the village of Russian Porekno. To date, investigators, in cooperation with servicemen of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, have extracted the bodies of killed civilians from the places indicated by the accused. The necessary examinations are carried out on them, but the examinations already carried out and the corresponding actions in the Russian WIG indicate a massive crime committed by Ukrainian militants. What does this mean? Of course, representatives of law enforcement agencies will also give their qualifications. Of course, all of this should be consistent with the laws, with specific norms of law. But what does this mean? This suggests that it was not loners who acted like these, who became worse than animals, who perhaps were drugged by something or motivated by something. The point is that this is a mass action, and it is not an isolated one. This also shows that despite all the monstrous finds that have been discovered, all those who have been sponsoring the Kyiv regime for many years know what it is doing and continue to supply both money and weapons. During the ongoing preliminary investigation, the commanders of the Ukrainian armed formations who gave criminal orders, other accomplices of these crimes will be identified, and a criminal legal assessment of their actions will be given. We are confident that all those involved in these crimes will be identified and brought to justice under the law. We are calling. This is very important. This is an appeal to everyone. We call on all witnesses, all eyewitnesses of these atrocities of the Kyiv regime, to report the information they know to the Investigative Committee of Russia. The Investigative Committee has published the relevant contact details where you can call and leave information. Yes, it's complicated. Those who have experienced it, even in the form of witnesses, I can imagine how impossible it is to retell, even to remind myself of what was seen, heard, experienced. But this must be done in the name of those who were killed, in the name of those who were not just killed, but tortured. Look at these photos. This must be done in the name of future generations who should know the truth. In the name of the relatives of those killed, who should know that we are united in our rejection of such crimes and similar ideology, and that we protect people, and that we do everything as a country, as a people, in order to prevent this from happening on our land, against our citizens and compatriots. We appeal to everyone who can share information to do this, to find these spiritual forces in themselves. This is extremely important right now. Speaking of war crimes in Russian Porekny, it should be noted that the neo-Nazis of the Zelensky regime, they did not invent anything new. More than once in the history of the Western states, to which the Kyiv regime so verbally aspires, on which this Kyiv gang so depends, both the armed forces of the West and Western elites have previously committed brutal repressions against civilians. How many such examples? And even if we do not take into account the history of the Middle Ages, when in the course of the European religious wars that followed the Reformation, the troops of both Protestant and Catholic kingdoms organized pogroms of peaceful cities, destroyed the cathedrals of opposing denominations, and publicly executed everyone praying for other rites in the squares. That's even if you don't take it. Although this terrible tradition has turned out to be one of the most tenacious in the practice of armed conflicts, and there are hundreds of such examples, by the way, and at the same time, the researchers note that the repressions against the civilian population were particularly influenced by the introduction of first national and then nationalist rhetoric in propaganda. But if you don't take this, look at more modern times, at a new history passing into the newest one. This was also done with the Orthodox inhabitants of Little Russia, whose territories were temporarily under Austrian and then Polish occupation during the First World War and the Civil War. Often, the occupiers killed civilians who spoke Russian without even formal courts or investigations, just on the basis of rejection. According to the authors of the so-called Tolergov Almanac, dedicated to the ethnic cleansing of Austrians against the Russian and Little Russian population, the occupiers took some peasants to concentration camps, including the Allergov of this rubber, and some were executed on the spot. But even this inhuman experience pales in comparison with the atrocities committed by the predecessors of the current militants of the Kursk region alone before its occupation during the Great Patriotic War. Well, as a matter of fact, that's why the Kyiv regime glorifies Nazi collaborators, because now in the same Kursk region, they are doing the same thing as those who were worshipped by the bastards they glorified. Just remember, during the years of occupation, the fascist invaders and their accomplices then killed more than 18,000 civilians on the Kursk land, 9,826 prisoners of war. Now someone will say, well, you can say anything, let's look at the facts, and if there are documents, but there are. The act on the atrocities in the village of Apanasovka of the Koronevsky district says, direct quote, the 15th of March 1943rd year, at 11 o'clock in the afternoon, a group of German thugs broke into the village in the number of 80 people and massacred civilians. 29 people were shot with machine guns and machine guns. You won't believe it, but the following phrase sounds like a verdict on the Kiev regime. 5 people were killed by grenades. The same thing was discovered today, now, in these days of ours, in an effort to achieve the submission of the local population, as then the occupiers used various forms of repression, terror, and, of course, especially severe punishment awaited those who knew and hid the location of the partisans. In the act of the 22nd of July, 1943 of the year on the atrocities of the Nazi invaders, in the village of Kokotovka, Ivnyansky district, the facts of the shooting of Kostrominsky Anton Arkipovich, 39 years old, Kostroma Fedor Efimovich, 47 years old, and a 14-year-old teenager Kostrominsky Nikolai, are given on the 17th of July. The fascists simply shot them. The bodies of the executed collective farmers were not allowed to be buried by German officers for 2 days. In Sapagov, in December of the 41st year, the invaders poisoned 538 patients of the local hospital. 330 people died of starvation. After the liberation of Kursk, the remains of more than 1,000 innocent children destroyed by the Nazis were found in a sand pit near the village of Shetinka, in 7 pits. The same patterns, the same stencils, the same ideology, but when will this world community wake up? When will they realize that instead of sending hundreds of billions of dollars to help the really needy, the hungry, those who need medicines, those who need food, those who need education, they direct it to those who kill, torturing the elderly and children at the same time. And they do it historically. A little over 80 years have passed, and now they are spiritual. But you can't say spiritual, because there is no soul there, or she is such that it can no longer be called a soul. It's just that the ideological heirs of those inhumans on the same land are carrying out their punitive actions and repressions against the civilian population. Yes, it's tragic to talk about it, but there is one thing, and the result for them will be the same.